How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Ganji. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, I'm going to read a quick chapter from Managing Inmate Behavior. Today, we're going to talk about managing unruly inmates. Basically, this is how we see the inmate in front of us, and through their behaviors, what do we label those behaviors? I was able to break it down to three types: annoying, disruptive, and threatening. So today, we're going to break down the differences as quoted in this book. And then we're going to talk about a scenario real quick, a common scenario that most of us deal with. It's going to be basically inmates that tend to cover their window or their cell with a sheet or a blanket or whatnot, which obstructs us from having a complete visual of the inmate. And then basically how in that moment an inmate can go from being annoying to being disruptive to being an actual threat. Now, granted, this book covers a lot more. The next chapter itself in this book would be about the function. What is the inmate trying to accomplish when they commit to these behaviors? But right now, I just want to focus on how we see that behavior and how we label it. So basically, when it comes to unruly inmates, is this inmate being annoying, disruptive, or are they being a threat? So there are three types of unruly behaviors. So understanding the gap between inexperienced and experienced staff is crucial in managing inmate behavior. Between being reactionary and being established lies trial and error, conflict, ownership, and accountability. Now, all these factors come into play when managing inmate behavior, especially unruly behavior. From my experience, there are three specific types of unruly behavior. So you got the annoyance, you got the disruptive, and you got the threatening. Annoyance requires the least immediate response. Disruptive requires a more urgent response. And threatening demands the highest level of emergent and immediate response. Essentially, we have a ladder. The higher the situation climbs, so annoying, disruptive, and threatening, the more critical and timely the staff's response must be. This increases liability, and how staff perceive and label the behavior is crucial. All behaviors can overlap, causing confusion in labeling. So for clarity, let's first introduce each behavior in isolation. So the first one I got is annoyance. So annoying behaviors do not significantly impact the systematic and effective operations of jails or prisons. Here are some examples of behaviors considered to be annoying. Just some, not all. Got the know-it-all. So that's the inmate who constantly claims or boasts that they know staff's job better than the staff themselves. We also got the interrogator. Now, the inmate who constantly questions and judges every staff's directive. Then you got the litigator, the inmate who threatens to involve outside contacts like family lawyers, politicians, etc., to coerce staff into circumventing rules. You got the chronic complainer. That's the inmate who continually finds reasons to complain. You got the pseudo-intellectual, the inmate who tries to intimidate staff by using big words out of context. Either way, these behaviors share three main commonalities. Control shift. The inmate tries to coerce staff into relinquishing some level of authority. These behaviors are meant to passively intimidate staff into questioning their professional judgment. Second one's about frequency, too. Annoying behaviors become more irritating the more they are persistently employed. The inmate's frequent efforts are intended to wear down staff, making them want to avoid the inmate, which is precisely what the inmate wants. The inmate wants to be left alone to do what they want to do. So technically, the inmate becomes annoying, and we just don't want to deal with the inmate. So some staff will look to avoid when technically we need you to engage. It's really an exchange of will. The shift in staff's actions from what is right or wrong to what is most convenient is detrimental. So again, maybe more convenient for me to not engage in it, but that doesn't mean we've addressed the problem. And again, annoying is usually something that me as a frontline officer, if I'm dealing with that inmate, I should be able, through persistence, deal with it. We don't need to bring it up a notch just yet. And self-control. Staff must never give in. They need to respond immediately and persistently to maintain control. Some staff may look for quick fixes by giving in, but the right choice is to maintain authority, which builds confidence and eventually shifts the situation in favor of staff. Again, it's the persistence. So an annoying inmate typically does not require an immediate emergent response and does not significantly impact the facility's systematic operations and resources. And that's the key. The key is when the behavior starts to affect the systematic operations. Right now, being annoying may only just affect the person that the individual is dealing with, that the unruly inmate's dealing with. Disruptive behaviors. That's number 2. Disruptive behaviors affect and limit the effective running of jail or prison operations. So I got 2 examples here. I got the inmate that cries wolf. So that's an inmate that knows how to manipulate policies and procedures for personal gain, like housing manipulation, etc. PREA would be one, the weaponizing of PREA. They use specific keywords or actions to force staff to respond predictably. They could feign medical emergencies, stuff like that. Now, Grant, I want to mention something. A lot of people may believe that an inmate has to be super smart to manipulate policies and procedures, and that's not always the case. Sometimes procedures are so micromanaged that it doesn't allow for discretionary effort. So all the inmate has to do is pretty much remember what the procedure says. Granted, the policy is the outcome, but the inmates, if the inmates are able to take control of the procedure because it's so micromanaged where there is no discretionary effort that can lead to the same outcome, then pretty much we're giving them the ability to manipulate us. So a lot of people, again, may say, well, inmates got to be super smart to manipulate policies and procedures. It's not. It's sometimes the procedures are so micromanaged, all the inmate has to do is just dictate what the procedure is, and then staff may not have any discretionary effort. Again, it's the what versus the how. I believe that with us, tell us what needs to be done, and we'll figure out the how. And also explain to us the why, but we'll figure out the how so we have some discretionary effort, because in corrections, it's fluid. It's fluid, and you're going to have to make decisions on the fly that the procedure of whatever that policy needs to be, it's not there because that situation has not occurred yet. And then you have the resistor. Refuses to comply, slowing down daily operations, like someone that's refusing to lock in, count up, take a cellmate, etc. Time and location are crucial. Disruptive inmates understand that prison and jail operations run on a strict schedule. Their negative or manipulative behavior can halt or delay operations as resources are diverted to address them. Solving these issues often requires going beyond the frontline staff's authority. That's the key. Now it's no longer my ability to solve the matter. I have to follow it up. I got to call my supervisor. I got to do something. The pressure to maintain normal operations is paramount. Sometimes staff may concede to the inmate's immediate demands to keep operations moving forward. However, a balanced approach is necessary, involving both short-term response to isolate the inmate and long-term resolution without the pressure of time constraints. Staff must revisit the disruptive inmate for a more permanent solution when operational pressure eases. So a disruptive inmate may require an elevated level of immediate response due to their impact on facility operations and resources. So granted, guys, if I'm dealing with an inmate that's disruptive, let's say I'm a sergeant, I'm coming in, I'm trying to, deal with this inmate, but also maintain operations in a timely fashion. I may feel the pressure of time to go ahead and now quickly try to solve this inmate's concern, which actually puts it in favor of the inmate. Where basically I may need to now immediately react, isolate the problem, and revisit the long-term solution later on. Because the last thing you want is to allow that pressure of time to make you concede on a correctional objective. So worst comes to worst, isolate the problem and revisit a long-term solution later on. Because that's kind of what disruptive inmates want. They know that there's a pressure of time to solve something. So with that said, they are going to try to hold it out as long as they can because they know the pressure of time, you'll start weakening your stance. So it's great to just kind of get in, de-escalate, it's not negotiate, de-escalate, but within that time constraint, you know what, I'm done. Let's go ahead and isolate this concern and we'll revisit it later. Because again, the longer you tend to de-escalate, it winds up becoming a negotiation because the pressure of time, the pressure of people on top of you to solve the matter, all of a sudden you start conceding on correctional objectives, which really are non-negotiable. And then the threatening behaviors. Threatening behaviors demand the highest level of immediate response and have the most significant impact on jail or prison operations. So here's some examples on some threatening behaviors. We got the aggressor who harms or threatens to harm others. You got the downtrodden, the one who harms or threatens to harm themselves. Then you got the destroyer that destroys or he destroys or she destroys or threatens to destroy property like sprinkler heads, stuff like that. The traveler. Found in unauthorized areas, indicating a failure to maintain accountability for those whereabouts. For me, when I see a traveler, someone that's out of bounds, I think that's a systematic concern. And I do truly believe that is a threat to the facility. That's why it's on there. I don't care, even if they're walking around doing nothing, you're a threat because you shouldn't be in that area. the influencer, and holds influence over other inmates or staff, like gang leaders or expert manipulators. So threatening behavior puts staff responses under serious scrutiny due to high liability. Staff must respond immediately and safely following facility policies and procedures. Unruly inmates understand the pressure for an immediate response and may manipulate staff into acting impulsively. Each threat must be taken seriously, even if manipulative. While the inmate may control what staff do, they cannot and should never control how it is done. Good systems should allow for some discretion in response. So a threatening inmate requires an immediate and emergent response, profoundly affecting the facility's systematic operations and resources. Okay, so now I want to give you the example. Again, it's all come from the book. I'm just reading from the book. And what's great is when you buy the book from Blue 360 Media, it gives you it online as well through their library. Now, this is an example of something we face a lot, which is the covering of a window or a cell door, whatever it is, something that blocks the visual for the officer. Now, in this case here, you're going to clearly see where the inmate goes from annoying to disruptive to threat, but you're going to see how the officer kind of understands where it starts to elevate and reacts accordingly. And then I'll give you a breakdown so we can further explain it. So here's the example. So in a perfect world, these unruly behaviors would work in isolation of each other, right? You know, staff would notice the behavior, check all the boxes, and then label it accordingly. In corrections, that's not how it works. Here is when the topic becomes a bit tricky. Annoyance, disruptive, and threatening barely ever occur in isolation of each other. In all actuality, staff will have to deal with all three of these behaviors at once. I'm not saying that they will have three separate incidences in which each behavior is occurring simultaneously. Rather, I am saying most situations that correctional staff will face when dealing with an unruly inmate could or will fall into all three categories. Now, I'm going to go over the scenario now. Now, granted, in the next chapter is the function. The function is going to be more about the inmate's perspective, why they're doing what they're doing, the function of their behavior. Right now, for this video, we're only talking about how we see the behavior and how we label it in one of those three categories. And again, it's going to be unruly behavior. So we're going to either label it annoyance, disruptive, and threatening. And it's based on what's needed and the time and effort to respond. So, for example, every night when Officer Smith does his rounds, inmate White has a sheet covering the inside of his cell door window. The sheet blocks Officer Smith's ability to see in and have a visual of the inmate. Now, be advised, inmate White is single-celled, so no cellmate, and he's in a close custody unit. He is also an inmate who has a history of constant rule violations. Officer Smith knocks on the cell door and asks inmate White to take down the sheet. Inmate White, frustrated, rips down the sheet and yells at Officer Smith to quit his bullshit. Officer Smith gives the inmate the once over, ensures he is still alive and breathing, and then moves on to the next cell. Half an hour later, as Officer Smith was doing his rounds, again, he noticed that inmate White, once again, had the sheet hanging over the inside of his window. Officer Smith knocks on the cell door. Hey, White, take this down or else I'm going to have to knock on your cell door every half an hour. Inmate White rips down the sheet once again. Yo, Smith, you're seriously being an ass, my man. You know I'm good. Just let me be. Officer Smith, a bit frustrated, makes eye contact with inmate White and continues to move on to the next cell. At this point, inmate White's actions are starting to annoy Officer Smith. Not only does inmate White keep hanging up his sheet, blocking Officer Smith's view, but inmate White is also becoming quite disrespectful. Officer Smith's efforts to manage the situation are within his authority of control. He does his due diligence. He ensures that on each of his rounds, he gets a visual of inmate White. Inmate White, on the other hand, is becoming quite annoyed by Officer Smith's persistent effort to keep him from blocking his window. As the night progresses, Officer Smith finds himself routinely knocking on the cell door and inmate White routinely ripping the sheet down. About midway through the night, inmate White has had enough. This time, when Officer Smith knocks on his cell door, inmate White yells back, "I'm good, Smith. Move on. Take it down, White." "Nah, Smith, I'm done with you. You want it down, you can open up the cell and take it down yourself." Officer Smith knocks on the cell door one more time. "Yo, White, take it down. I'm going to have to call the Sarge. I need to have a visual." "Call the Sarge, Smith. I ain't taking shit down." Officer Smith then pulls out his radio and calls his area supervisor. "Sergeant Jones, I'm going to need you to come down to H unit at your earliest convenience." Sergeant Jones radios back that he will be en route to H unit in 5 mics. Officer Smith then proceeds to finish his rounds in preparation for Sergeant Jones' arrival. 10 minutes later, Sergeant Jones enters the unit and Officer Smith breaks down his night with inmate White. Frustrated, Sergeant Jones heads over to inmate White's cell with Officer Smith. Upon their arrival, they both notice the sheet is still up, blocking any visual of inmate White inside his cell. Hey, White, this is Sergeant Jones. Take your sheet down and keep it down. I ain't taking down shit, Sarge. White, take the sheet down or we'll come in and get it. Then come in. I'll be right here sleeping. Sergeant Jones then turns to Officer Smith and says, this motherfucker, he ain't going to take down the sheet, damn it. Now I have to pull 2 officers from the west side to get his cell popped and get in there to take the sheet. They're both probably doing mail breaks right now. Sarge, I was on him all night, but now he's just refusing. It's not you, Smith. It's him. Now I have to stop what we're doing to pull a fucking sheet down. This is so fucking annoying. Sergeant Jones walks over to the phone. Now I'm going to have to call this in. While Sergeant Jones heads towards the phone, Officer Smith remains by inmate White's cell door. White, what are you doing? Let's make it an easy night. Take it down. How about you both make it an easy night for yourselves and leave me be? Be careful with your words, White. I'm just saying, Smith, pop my cell and find out. Officer Smith turns away from the cell and walks over to Sergeant Jones. Hey, Sarge, before you hang up the phone, I believe Smith is making threats to get us if we pop his cell. This is some bullshit. I should have never taken the overtime. Sergeant Jones pauses and thinks for a second. Now I'm going to have paperwork to do. Eventually, inmate White was extracted from his cell by a 5-man suited team after refusing multiple orders to cuff up. The sheet was confiscated, and inmate White was charged with refusing direct orders and making threat towards staff. As for Officer Smith, the rest of his night went a lot smoother. Sergeant Jones stayed late due to all the paperwork that needed to be completed. So let's break this down a bit further so we can get a better understanding of how Officer Smith and Sergeant Jones handled the situation. Officer Smith was a professional with his directives. Officer Smith never negotiated his efforts to de-escalate was centered on explaining to inmate White why he needed the sheet down. That was for the visual. And trying not to get the sergeant involved. Because at this point, it's just me and him. He's still listening. So Officer Smith remained persistent with his correctional objective. As long as inmate White ripped down the sheet during Officer Smith's tour, there was no need to defer the matter up the chain of command, in this case called the sergeant. Yes, Officer Smith was a bit annoyed that he had to knock on the cell each time, which stopped him briefly from moving forward with his tour. But with that in mind, inmate White is in a close custody unit, and these types of behaviors are usually best handled without the immediate need to write a charge. Again, we're talking about a close custody punitive unit, and we all know that unit is not a unit you run by writing charges all day, because that's what you'd be doing. Officer Smith knew that inmate White wasn't a threat at first, so he managed the behavior issue by remaining persistent and addressing it each and every time he came across it. The sheet blocking his visual. Take it down, and the inmate complied at first. Officer Smith recognized he had to pivot when inmate White refused to get up and take down his sheet. At this point, inmate White's behavior elevated the situation from annoying to disruptive. Because now he's not taking down the sheet. Now it's just blocking me from moving forward. And now I need help because I can't just pop the cell door and take the sheet. It's a safety issue. So now I'm going to need a supervisor and 2 GAs and make it a little bit more of a controlled effort. Inmate White went from complaining and complying to outright resisting. Officer Smith recognized the switch immediately and called for assistance in his effort to complete the correctional objective, a proper tour. Sergeant Jones, even though he was annoyed at the issue, not Officer Smith, came on the scene, spoke to Officer Smith, and went immediately to address the concern with inmate White. Sergeant Jones was able to confirm that inmate White was resisting. Sergeant Jones tried to gain compliance from inmate White. Inmate White still refused. Sergeant Jones tried to de-escalate the situation by motivating inmate White's compliance, but inmate White refused. At no point did Officer Smith or Sergeant Jones make any attempt to negotiate through inmate White's behavior by sacrificing the needed correctional objective. Sergeant Jones did not allow for the constraints of operations, meal breaks, etc., to affect his decision to act immediately. He called it in and requested 2 officers to assist in the matter. Sergeant Jones also made it clear that his frustration had nothing to do with Officer Smith doing his job. Sergeant Jones made it clear that his frustration was due to the inmate White not taking down his sheet. While Sergeant Jones was on the phone, Officer Smith was forced to make one more pivot. Inmate White made a subtle threat directed towards staff if they decided to pop his cell. Officer Smith notified Sergeant Jones immediately, and the game completely changed. In the end, the call was made for a cell extraction, and with that said, cell extractions can easily impact operations, pull on resources, and can truly present a safety issue for staff and inmates. Now, as you can see, the situation evolved in its efforts to address and respond. Each pivot made by staff was in their recognition of the proper level of behavior that was presented by inmate White. Even if inmate White made the choice to comply after the cell extraction was already in motion, cell extraction for safety reasons would continue to go as planned. Even though both Officer Smith and Sergeant Jones were annoyed by inmate White's behavior, they never downplayed the need to address the issue with a proper and timely response. Officer Smith was initially frustrated because his correctional objective was being delayed each time he had to tell inmate White to take down the sheet. And Sergeant Jones felt the pressure of operations as he had to try and get that sheet and complete the correctional objective. Both staff understood the need for a complete visual and never, no matter how frustrated they became, settled for anything less. There were shortcuts that Officer Smith and Sergeant Jones could have taken. Officer Smith could have looked to avoid issues with inmate White and allowed him to keep a sheet over his cell window, but Officer Smith stayed true to his correctional objective, having a complete visual of the inmate. Officer Smith also recognized the need to pivot. He understood perfectly well what was in his authority to solve and what would require higher level assistance. Officer Smith's persistence is truly noteworthy. As for Sergeant Jones, he felt the pressure of operations and the limited resources, but he never let that deter the need to respond and respond effectively. Even though he felt annoyed by inmate White's actions, he never downplayed the need for a proper and elevated response. When all three behaviors exist, annoying, disruptive, and threatening, the action taken must coincide with the highest level of behavior present. Both Officer Smith and Sergeant Jones recognized immediately when the situation evolved from complaining, complying, to resisting, to being a threat. When the situation elevated, the shift went from Officer Smith to Sergeant Jones. Sergeant Jones had more authority to solve the matter because of the resources needed. The pressure to run daily operations, the pressure for more resources never forced the officer or the sergeant to minimize the concern. Basically, both staff members remained true to both the original and heightened correctional objectives. Quick summary. So staff must be aware that there are three behaviors that require a different level of emergent response. So annoying, disruptive, and threatening. Be advised, labeling the behavior is different than the actual function of the behavior. Function of the behavior will be discussed in the next chapter. So if you get this book, that would be chapter 2. Labeling the behavior helps staff prepare themselves for a proper and timely response. All three behaviors can occur isolated from one another, but with that said, most occur simultaneously as the situation evolves. And staff must always be aware that if multiple behaviors coexist, the one with the highest level of response takes a priority. So guys, I want to run it through. I think that's a real case scenario. And if you guys are interested, the book is available on the market. It's basically a good effort to kind of close that gap between inexperience and experience. So basically, this is kind of like 20-something years of experience looking back and saying, okay, this is what I've learned. Now I got to translate that lesson to the new boots coming in, because this is something that, may be simplified in a book, but takes years to learn. I didn't just learn that in one day. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post a video. Stay safe.